Hey there, everybody. So, you may have been wondering where I've been for the last month. Well, I've been working on this really cool little program. It's a little zine builder. It turns my blog posts into zines that you can print out and you can share with people that you think would like to read them. So yeah, sorry for the delay, but I figured that people would find this kind of fun to use. Now, currently it's just a command line program, which means you need to open up the command line or the terminal. I know that can be kind of terrifying for some people, but I do plan to eventually produce a user interface for this software so it's a little easier to use. But yeah, it's really nice. It just uses basic templates and it works really well, and I just wanted to show what I've been up to. Now to the main programming. Recently, I started walking with a cane. I moved from the relatively flat Metro Detroit, where I didn't need to walk around very much thanks to my vehicle, to an East Coast city where there is now much variation in the terrain, and I was without a vehicle after my transmission was destroyed on the journey. I underestimated what this transition could do to my legs and feet. Even before, I struggled to walk for more than 30 minutes on flat surfaces, but I figured it was just me being out of shape. I tried walking more, but I found out quickly that my legs were just not getting better even as the rest of my body was. I found myself more inclined to hide away instead of going out and enjoying the weather, even on nice days, because of the sheer exhaustion of simply having to go to the grocery store the day before. After a series of seemingly simple trips leading in the near self-destruction of my legs, and the instability of my knees finally catching up to me, I realized that the only option was to start using a cane that I purchased last year because of a temporary injury. I refused it at first, thinking I didn't need it. Part of me was scared of discrimination in this economic spiral, but it's hardly the cane's fault. Although I would prefer to have a wooden cane, it's quite nice in of itself. It is adjustable and light, allowing me to adapt to the right configuration. At first I had it at the wrong height. I made it a little longer, and with slight adjustments, it made moving my body around so much easier. It wasn't even that I needed to walk, but rather that my legs needed a break, and suddenly, with this condition satisfied, it felt like I could climb the world. Perhaps not Everest, but the Everest of my own world, and beyond. Suddenly I was no longer simply tired in bed, having to rest for days to recover from the adjustment. I could live my life again and spend more time doing what I actually enjoyed. I could even reconnect with nature somewhat, not having to be stuck inside all the time just because everything is so tiring to do. It doesn't matter if there is or is not something medically diagnosable, or even whether or not this identifies me as a disabled person or not, but rather that it produces new possibilities for the future that never existed before. Not just futures for my own personal experiences encapsulated in a protective amnion to shield its influence from the rest of the world, as is the purpose of so much disability pity pornography that is plastered over so many disability charities, but a new edge of politics, shaped around the materialism of the body that has been produced, and embracing what it is now producing. In the 21st century, we are embracing completely novel political, environmental, and health challenges that are transforming our bodies and its relation to the world as we speak. Toxic chemical industrial production starting in the 20th century finds itself incorporated into our bodies. Microplastics are detected in all aspects of our bodies. Interestingly, the discourse often focuses on men and sperm, how chemicals are making us gay, or how it impacts our brain or digestive tracts, thus supposedly causing a variety of neurodiverse conditions, of course. The increasing stress of the failures of capital and harmful new social interfaces distributed across online networks are producing a wide variety of mental illnesses, addictions, and conditions, one that cannot be simply written off as increased awareness. Every attempt as to reverse this process instead further incorporates it into our bodies, further replacing life with simulations, detached propaganda, manufactured chemicals, and plastics. Undetectable because the ontologies of the sciences attempting to measure them, these indirect interactions produced at their complex intersections are changing the world around our bodies faster than we can produce explanations for them. In order to survive, we have to transform our relation to politics and society. We have to find new relations between our body and the worlds around us, like how ecosystems evolve in response to the stress of mass extinction. Within capitalism, there exists a social machine whose purpose is to protect capitalism by identifying individual categories of classes and processing them, similar to a computer. For example, racial minorities are defined on strict lines based on a combination of physical appearance, language, and history, taking these complex relations and reducing them down into categories that can be easily compared, contrasted, and manipulated. Liberalism has taken the complex, multifaceted battles of the Black, Indigenous, and people of color movement and reduced their complicated histories and relations down to categories that beg to be equalized, because their surface values are interchangeable. To liberalism, the solution to anti-racist struggle is not to acknowledge the material processes that led to that struggle in the first place, but rather creating an entirely new category to organize the tension produced by this struggle. Liberals, presented with this challenge to their systemic power, which is critical to maintaining its control on worldwide trade and asserting dominance against opposing politics internationally, transformed conservative campaigns for gun control intended on targeting the Panthers and other radical groups to dismantle access to physical defensive power and to instead encourage integration into capitalist modes of production through acceptance in the form of civil rights. By throwing this kind of bone to minorities, this presented minorities with two possibilities itself. Those who are willing to compromise would be willing to submit themselves to a liberal capitalist economy, resulting in reducing the number of remaining radicals, breaking up cooperative community movements, and allowing for remaining isolated movements to easily be captured by police forces and effectively cleaned off the map. Liberal acceptance and lifestyles exist to shut us up and get our butts back into the production seats. In the case of disabled people, this has been attempted through transforming the radical social model of disability towards incorporating accessibility needs and rights into structures of work, rent, legal matters, and other matters within a capitalist society. Despite being promised fairness with assimilation to the capitalist machine, capitalism in of itself is an inherently discriminating process that produces hierarchies based on access to capital, something that is materially reflected in minorities historically with struggles that they inherited to this day. This, along with having no real resolution to bigoted forces outside of legal repression, which is complicated by the bureaucratic civil rights claims process, a process that can be easily ignored by authorities if they desire, leading to little being done about actual discrimination outside of the most egregious cases, and ultimately low representation of minorities in higher power roles. Additionally, the result of the implementation of DEI policies and the protections that affirmative action provide lead to a twofold problem. For white racists, it is painted like a sense of privilege, one that actively is being attacked for its so-called biases, while also forcing minorities to aggressively compete for limited access to employment and other access to resources while allowing the rest of society to continue its discriminatory practices, leading to a complete failure to live up to any promise, as if it was ever about us and our needs in the first place, but with an additional layer of motivation for racists to take even more from them. Thus, it only makes sense how liberalism in the United States and similar movements in other post-imperialist countries have led to fascism. The inability to actually make any sense of these politics through a regime of state-assigned identities leads to a shift in priorities to what to do with these categories. Instead of unsuccessfully trying to extract their labor and production while having to spend extensive resources suppressing their desire for liberation, fascism can simply use these categories as a way to identify subjects for elimination. This is what makes the fascist position so attractive to many in the current way of understanding political groups. This squares away perfectly with the original intentions of capitalism and imperialist colonialism. After all, this process began as a means to extend white Western European power across the entire world, extracting resources from faraway lands to build an empire of control. The world over the last 500 years has been carved out by racists trying to extract value from every corner of the earth to attempt to construct their image of the perfect man. With this, it requires the regulation of bodies on every level, not just for production, but also reproduction, to manufacture the mass production of this image. With racism, it aims to eliminate the people of native lands and displace them to extract their labor until they are no longer wanted. keeping a distinct separation between whites and BIPOC to maintain control of this process. With ableism, it exists to process the productive capacities of an entire population, eliminating those who are not supposedly able to keep up with the flows, while sexism, homophobia, and transphobia intend to control reproductive structures that exist to reproduce the nuclear family, acting as the base unit for the reproduction of this system, modeled after the harsh control structures within bourgeois families. Upon this realization, it becomes clear just how all of these processes link up together to reproduce the racist controlling forces of the white powerful men. Initially, they expected our differential bodies to bend over and die, and when we resisted, they realized they needed to kill us. That is what founds the basis of fascist eugenic extermination. The truth is that no such categories actually exist that are inscribed onto our bodies. Our bodies are just material organizations of flesh, bone, social relations, and adaptive technologies that allow us to navigate the world. The categories, on the other hand, are a product of this organizational process of society, a means to make sense of our traumas and organizing these bodies into a structure of how they plug into larger historical narratives. Identity is a consequence of social relations that is produced through the separation and division of people and other subjects to organize them into narrative structures. For example, I have recently started walking with a cane, and I'm astonished to discover how many people, most of whom I have never previously met, already begin to compose narratives of how I got here, when in reality my cane walking is simply a consequence of a conscious decision between the cane and my body to deal with a particular situation, walking long distances up and down steep hills, which causes me difficulty. It has greatly improved my life, but I already have been categorized by this binary machine like a computer calculating the boundaries of an object. Something similar occurs to me with being transgender, my homosexuality, the expression of my kinks, and my other illnesses. This is not necessarily to say that all group identity is necessarily bad in all instances. Unified identity constructed through radical social movements in the 1970s were essential for organizing and mutual aid, but this politics was then dismantled by incorporating these identities back into liberal narratives of fairness within capitalism, through the use of categorization, and thus dividing class solidarity, along with our own internal scuffles. This process forced groups that were spontaneously forming through radical pressures to be contained within a predictable calculus and transform the surface of these movements into static shells, easy to dispatch with various methods. However, as it turns out, our bodies are constantly transforming regardless of any categorization. From birth, we are experiencing transformation throughout our bodies, evolving, developing, and breaking down, and forcing us to change course with how we approach the future of every development. Most people with forms of congenital blindness must adapt through their lives to the changing impact of their vision, while those with a predisposition for their psychotic disorders know very well the challenges of managing more and more extreme cycles of their internal mental processes as their illness progresses. I've noticed this personally with aging as well. As I reached my 30s, part of my body that I had simply taken for granted started to make unstable shifts. My knees would randomly go out, pain erupts in my feet and muscles, and I'm already finding myself needing to compensate for my own ability to deal with my own physical weakness. Fascism views this transformation as something inherently harmful because this decay represents a breakdown from the structures that it's trying to uphold through its own image so much. This is why, for example, the Nazi Party started its eugenics campaigns with the disabled and the elderly. These bodies represent failures to conform to the needs of a fascist agenda, and thus must be thrown out. Despite the horrific violence against disabled people, it is this very belief that makes fascist regimes surprisingly weak at their core. Not only must they use massive amounts of resources to identify and round up the millions that fit into these identified borders, they need to produce or utilize structures, ghettos, to be able to collect, store, and organize these individuals for extermination, and let alone all the expenses of the physical extermination itself. Every point of this process is further slowed down by the resistance of individuals who force costs of these procedures to skyrocket for simply not bending over and dying. This is all a tremendous expense for the preservation of a so-called perfect white man's face as a template for humans in a so-called perfect society. This is not only a massive waste of resources, but also leads to the reduction of the physical numbers of their forces. After all, they do not see someone who is blind, in a wheelchair, using a cane, schizophrenic, diabetic, or whatever else as viable for their political project in the long run, and certainly not ones in the front lines of theory and combat. These people are either simply nodes of transmission of their virus at best and are targets for extermination. Queers, women, BIPOC, and other minorities alongside are used as pawns to try to suppress their own people, only to be consumed once they are no longer useful. Like a wasteful, wealthy child, the fascist movement throws anyone under the bus with 1,000 arms in 1,000 directions to make a little progress in its achievements, weighting every strategic move as a transaction, an approach which squares perfectly with the translation of their economy of ethics into a means to produce their ideological values in a dominant white society. Not only this, but they cannot even preserve their creation if they were able to succeed. This is the biological consequences of the reduction in gene and phenotype expression caused by this intentional reduction. Genetic and phenotypical diversity gives humans and all other species the ability to contend with the challenges of existence through a wide range of possibilities on every stratum of our bodies and presence. This is well observed in domestic populations of exotic pets, where certain genetic lines become unsustainable after multiple iterations of extensive breeding due to the inheritance of major genetic defects to try to conform a breed to a particular standard or market expectation. The proliferation of this idea of a racist utopia, the nearly indistinguishable faces of white men, is a reactionary breeding project to reduce diversity of expression down so far to preserve the perfection of the image of this face into a runaway process of phylogenetic suicide, with no other possible conclusion than the extinction of the human race. And what more is it for than to preserve the power of white men as long as it can in a rush to burn out? Anti-fascists, in comparison, have a completely different goal that allows us to mobilize this population in ways that cannot be achieved through transactions. We try to find value in those who are transformed into the marginalized, ejected minoritarian classes, either from the conditions of their birth or as a series of life developments. These people are part of a disjointed, alienated, and rapidly breaking apart working class who are suffering the consequences of the toils of their body through centuries of repeated collective trauma, along with decades of environmental and media pollution that has pulled us all further and further away from solidarity with the rest of the oppressed masses. Thus, it is a challenging project of an anti-fascist movement to pull these forces together, not in a singular unified movement, but a complex political process that consumes fascist territories in all walks of life of the scale of the micropolitical, like viruses ripping through its flesh, via the recognition and protection of our allies on the ground, on the solidarity emerging through unified struggle for life against death, and for a new world of possibilities through our bodies. This process gives minorities a serious advantage in this war, because instead of closing down our possibilities and decreasing our numbers, it actively uses these experiences to explore the meaning of life in a million new directions, all while allowing us to cover each other's weaknesses and spontaneous developments of temporary political projects that exist to turn the tides of a tired and wounded towards a world of new possibilities for life. Contrary to what the average evangelical may believe, the cane is not the end of my life, but an entrance into a new one. I discovered this as I was able to scale hills, accessing new worlds that I never thought was possible. If a cane is capable of producing this with a simple adjustment to my gait by giving me an artificial third leg, then what possibilities are there in the future if we can employ these effects into a political praxis? Part of the struggle surrounding the discourse of disabled people is that our innovations have been appropriated by liberal and fascist aesthetics as a means to recapture these differences in human experience, through absorbing the new world that we have carved for ourselves into their structures of classifications and transforming them either into a normalized set of relations to society or tools to enhance the image of so-called perfect men. For example, think of how in many fictional or propaganda narratives, the subject of the visibly disabled person is used as a way to portray either the destruction of desirable futures or the production of undesirable ones as a way to maintain productive control over how we manage differing bodies. There is even an implication that our lives must be filled with suffering, especially regarding the transition to a mobility device. In these fictional or propagandist examples of images of disability, what we see is the technology of disabled people, such as the prosthesis, canes, or wheelchairs, which can be used to normalize a disabled person to return towards capitalist modes of production. An open source screen reader doesn't necessarily just exist to make users free. It is positioned in a social continuity to allow for the potential freedom of participating in a capitalist productivity as a worker. You work so that you can be free through this development. Those who appropriate the images of these tools thus see them as a way to perform better and somehow enhance the image of the racist white man to its fullest potential, shoving the disabled subject aside as merely a tool to achieve that greatness, to allow him to become a sort of super object where his ideals are accelerated infinitely towards the perfect individual. Technologies like Neuralink and many developments within anti-aging are only using the bodies of disabled people as a means to gain acceptance, funding, or attention. They don't exist to help those with disabilities, they exist to attempt to produce a new race of superior humans. This is in contrast with the relationship with bodies naturally decaying over time and adapting to the use of accessibility and mobility devices and the reality of becoming a new body. I didn't start using a cane to become a superior version of myself. I started using it to experience a life that didn't make me feel tired all the time when I came home from walking a long day at work and back. Whether it is superior to my younger years is a question that cannot be answered because I would never want to be that person again anyways. Accessibility and mobility is about granting access to a new form of life, one that allows me to trailblaze new futures. Being able to work more efficiently is only a consequence of the world I am creating with me and my cane, one that the organization of the state wants to recapture back into its operations, but it can produce countless more. This all ultimately leads back to the weaknesses in both the ontologies of identity's difference within liberalism and fascism. Both see this difference as a problem that must be coded into a particular binary machine. Two computers!
Everything's computer!
One desires for me to submit and get back to work to extract the maximum amount of labor capacity. The other desires to eliminate me to reduce the cost for other laborers who can produce work more efficiently. But what neither model wants to truly embrace is that possibility of new futures that such a new arrangement with a cane can create. Under both models, someone who becomes permanently disabled is an inferior resource, and the question becomes on what to do with that inferiority. That is not a future I will tolerate. With an ontology focused on new futures, of using new kinds of bodies to produce new possibilities, I am able to see the value that is produced through these experiences. This is not to say that we should actively seek out trauma, self-harm, destruction, or suffering, or that we should assume that any of these things produces some kind of inherent value. This simply absorbs us back into the liberal way of thinking as everything valuable is a potential transaction. Rather, these experiences produce completely new worlds that organize the signs of society and reality itself in new ways, allowing us to produce new solutions and ultimately political responses to our own suppression. Think, for example, about how the 504 sit-in protest was able to occupy a federal building in San Francisco for almost a month using the combination of different kinds of bodies and tools to create cryptic communications, block entrances, and resist physical interference, all while exploiting the machines of the social encoding of the disabled as pitiful people to weaken the morale of their resistance. What we need is the ability to organize protests on a spontaneous scale, to orient our politics towards producing these new kinds of assemblages that defeats the purpose of this mass categorization of bodies to allow us to form a resistance that the enemy could never imagine, because they, like narcissists, are too busy staring at the beauty of their own reflection to imagine anything else as the walls of the cave collapse around them. A disabled liberal is a less useful tool to extract labor from. A disabled fascist is someone that can be thrown away as soon as they are no longer valuable and can't be extracted from. But a disabled anti-fascist is an open door for new discussions of how the world can possibly be changed. Oftentimes, in the discourse of organizing the working class, more traditional white Marxists will often criticize minority politics as a form of distracting from larger class solidarity. This observation makes sense when we look at it from the context of the liberal ontology of difference, where all differences are produced by identities and uniqueness, and thus act as a means to separate groups based on the boundaries of these identities. However, with this new approach, seeing that bodies are differential variations capable of new kinds of production, a new kind of materialism is injected into Marxist discourse. Instead instead of these differences as being seen as a threat to solidarity, they become tools to construct new machines of solidarity. We stand by the person who walks with a cane not because they're a cane walker, but because they are part of our same struggle, and their position as a cane walker exists as a consequence of being positioned in a different place within the discourse of capital. Minority politics is the material expression of the consequences of capitalism across these differential bodies, and its discourses emerge as a consequence to describe that expression. It is a scientific and historical expression of how classism interacts with all walks of life and all sorts of different bodies in different positions in space and time. With this new lens, it gives us a new dimension to explore the proletariat, not as a unified mass of workers who are radicalized through specific relationship between themselves and their bosses, one that has repeatedly stopped short of actually producing any sort of long-term revolution, but rather as a class of people whose unique expressions of difference in subjective experience produces the depth of analysis that is only possible through observing our different reactions to this process. It is for this very reason why radical minority movements such as the wide assemblage of BIPOC, queer, and disabled movements from the 1970s were capable of even expressing such formidable opposition to the hegemony of the United States. But their limitations were in their ability to sustain themselves since they were unable to establish a true generalist internationalist movement, especially in the wake of the compromise of liberalism, reorienting the desire of the people towards a new generation of submission in response to being accommodated for their differences. We have seen what the dire consequences of this compromise has really had in the last few decades. Thus, it is only reasonable to pull back together these movements and embrace difference as a means to produce a new kind of fight. While it might not seem like it at first glance because of how much violent power is concentrated in the growing fascist reactionary right wing across the world, minorities actually hold incredible power among themselves. Fascists must use incredible violence to alienate, isolate, and intimidate minorities into submission, and liberals use their own sense of selves to construct barriers against solidarity. Both of these are to contain the power of minorities within assigned identities and structures. Fascists and liberals alike must act on paranoid identification to be able to recognize and eliminate their enemy, but this paranoid process depends on the positive identification of identity and cooperation from the masses. However, a new world, a new edge, produced not by static identities and guilt complexes, but rather on evolving relations to the world, can produce a new powerful form of political solidarity. This is the weapon that we can use to fight back against this force. These groups depend on our alienation in order to be successful in any capacity. Again, this is not to say that group identity is not a valuable asset. Rather, we need to take claim of what subjectivizes us into identities. We are not a group because someone else says we are. That is no different than throwing a bunch of animals into a fighting pen. Rather, we built our own ecological relations between each other naturally, forming bridges of identity when necessary and dissolving them when they are no longer needed, a constant socio-political ecology of change. We are forming a new relation to a new social ecology. Fascism is successful and continues to reproduce itself not because it is powerful, but because it is able to dig deeper than the microscope and form connections through microscopic glows of desire in society that construct reactionary apparatuses that allow us to be oppressed at a mass scale through micro-political relations. The recent death of Jonathan Joss, who died not just because he was murdered, but because an entire system of decisions made by many people to voluntarily ignore he and his husband's pleas for help in an aggressive harassment campaign for years, enabled a structure of increasing violence to form around him and take his life, is one such spontaneous death machine that can be deployed by fascism. The state enabled this death by simply allowing these interactions to happen. This is why we must work collectively to change the flows of desire in politics through embracing the importance of collective identity, not within just our own ideology, but as a material, political, and evolutionary tool for survival. When you see me in my cane, don't ask yourself what it's like to live as a young person with a cane. Instead, see what you can learn from me and my experiences, just as I'm doing from you. Existing is resisting, and the longer I stand in your way, regardless of what I need to continue standing, the longer that I can change the direction of this madness into something that can make something right out of a very wrong world. As Felix Guattari said, the order of the real is not destiny, one can change it. Through this change, a constant world of revolution is always occurring around us and within us, and is only a matter to see what potential is possible if we allow it to connect and speak freely.